My name is Sophia Lincon, and I am 27 years old. I was born and raised in the small snow-dusted town of Ashford, Vermont, where the winters are long, and the people's memories even longer. It was supposed to be my perfect Christmas. The smell of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen, pine needles glistened under fairy lights, and the fire cracked with the kind of warmth I thought only love could provide. For the last 6 years, I had shared this season and my heart with James Whitmore. James wasn't just my fiancé. He was the man who once carved our initials into a birch tree behind my father's old barn, the man who taught me how to dance in bare feet on frosty mornings, the man who once told me, with tears in his eyes, that I was his home. But James didn't cry on Christmas Eve. 1964. He didn't even look me in the eye. I had just finished placing the last ornament, a porcelain angel that belonged to my late mother, when he walked into the living room, coat already on, scarf loosely wrapped, eyes hollow. "I can't do this anymore, Soph," he said flatly, like he was quitting a job. I laughed nervously. "Do what? Decorate? We both know you're terrible at it." He shook his head. Us. I'm leaving." At first, I thought he meant for the night. Maybe to his mother's house in Montpelier. Maybe to clear his head. But then I saw the small suitcase by the door. The one I used to take on summer trips. The one I packed for him when we visited Cape Cod last year. "You're leaving?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But it's Christmas Eve. I've been offered a position at New Haven First Trust. It's in Connecticut. It's everything I've been working toward. I can't pass it up." "And what about me?" I asked, tears already hot behind my eyes. "What about our home? The one I've been trying to save since Papa passed?" He looked down at the wooden floor, ashamed, but not enough. "You knew we were behind on payments. I can't stay here and watch everything fall apart. I need a fresh start." The words didn't sink in until the door shut behind him. I sat in the silent house for hours, listening to the wind howl outside and the ticking of the old clock over the fireplace. The home James walked out of wasn't just bricks and wood. It was my father's legacy. A farmhouse that stood for generations. A place where my mother once baked cherry pies and my brother carved toy soldiers. The land was rich with stories, struggles, and sacrifices. But ever since Papa died from a heart stroke the previous spring, the bank had been circling like vultures. Oak Ridge National Bank had denied my loan application twice. They said I had no collateral, that a woman, especially a single one, couldn't manage a property that size on her own. They didn't care that I ran the orchard myself, that I sold every jar of apple preserves and every sack of cider like clockwork, that I worked from dawn to past dark. No. What mattered to them was that my last name wasn't a man's, and now, James, my supposed partner, my supposed future, had left when I needed him most. Left for a shiny desk in a city bank, while I was drowning in a loan I never asked for but desperately needed. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the angel on the tree, wondering what my mother would say, wondering how Papa could work so hard and still leave me with nothing but debt and doubt. By morning, the frost had spread across the inside of the windows, like icy veins, and something colder had formed inside me too. I wasn't going to beg for help. Not from James. Not from the bank. Not from anyone. I was going to rise, on my own. And I was going to make them all regret leaving me behind. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, hands trembling over a chipped teacup filled with black coffee. I hadn't eaten. My stomach was twisted too tight to hold anything down. Outside, the snow had fallen silently all night, covering everything in white as if trying to hide the wreckage James left behind. I had only $86 in my checking account, a month's worth of property tax overdue, and a loan denial letter from Oak Ridge National Bank sitting on the table like a death certificate. The bank had sent their final notice 3 days before Christmas. 30 days to pay in full, or foreclosure would begin. They knew Papa had passed. They knew I was alone, and they didn't care. I looked at the orchard from the back window. Rows of bare apple trees stretched into the distance, limbs like bones reaching toward the gray sky. Come spring, I'd have to prune them, fertilize the soil, pray for rain and good bees. But none of that mattered if I lost the land, my father's land. For 2 days, I cried quietly. Then I stopped. I gathered every paper my father ever kept: deeds, crop ledgers, vendor receipts, even his old war pension forms, and spread them across the dining table like a battlefield. I remembered something my papa once told me after a barn fire when I was 13. You only learn what you're made of when you got nothing left but your name. Well, I still had my name, and I still had pride. I rode into town on the third day after Christmas, wrapped in papa's wool coat, the one that still smelled like pine and pipe smoke. My boots were worn from chores, and my fingers were numb, but my heart was hardening with every step. I passed the Ashford General Store, where Mrs. Barry gave me a soft nod, the kind reserved for widows and ruined girls. I passed Wade's Diner, where James and I used to split cherry pie. Then I reached the red brick building that sat smugly on Main Street, the one with the polished brass letters, Oak Ridge National Bank. Inside, it was warm, perfumed by wax polish and old men's cologne. The floor glistened. The windows had wreaths. It didn't feel like a place that stole homes. I stepped up to the counter, where a young clerk with slicked back hair gave me a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Lincon," he said. "I'm afraid we've already explained. I'm not here to ask," I interrupted. "I'm here to listen. To understand why a man like James Whitmore could walk in here with nothing but a family name and walk out with a promotion. And why a woman who works 14-hour days on her own land can't get a loan." He cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore had excellent connections. His uncle sits on our board. "I'm afraid your case didn't meet the lending requirements." I narrowed my eyes. Connections. Of course. That was when something inside me shifted. I realized this wasn't about debt, or love, or risk. It was about power. And women like me, women without fathers, without husbands, without connections, weren't meant to have any. I walked out of the bank that day with my chin up and a fire lit beneath my ribs. Not because I had won, but because I had finally seen what I was up against. Over the next few weeks, I worked harder than I ever had in my life. I picked up shifts at Turner's Candle Mill, spent evenings helping Mrs. Ellis sew curtains for extra cash, and sold every last jar of apple jam I had left from autumn at the winter market in Greenville, 3 towns over. But that wasn't enough. So I wrote a letter to someone I hadn't spoken to in 7 years, Mason Everett, my father's old friend and business partner from his Army days, now living in Baltimore. He once offered Papa a stake in a small lending firm down there. Papa said no, he wanted to keep things in the family. But I wasn't Papa. I mailed that letter with trembling hands and waited. Weeks passed. Snow melted. February brought sleet and sorrow. I thought he had forgotten me, or worse, ignored me, until one morning, I found a letter in the mailbox sealed in gold-trimmed paper. It read, "Sophia, your father once told me you had more fight in you than any man he ever met. I believe him. Come to Baltimore. We'll talk." Mason Everett. I folded that letter, pressed it to my lips, and let out the first breath of hope I'd felt since Christmas Eve. I was going to save my home. And if I played it right, I was going to own the very bank that tried to take it from me. It was the first day of March when I packed up what little I had to: skirts, Papa's coat, my mother's angel ornament, and Mason Everett's letter, and boarded the 6:20 train to Baltimore, Maryland. I'd never been farther than Greenville. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't even wave goodbye to the town I once called home. There was nothing left for me there. Not the orchard. Not the house. Not even James. Ashford had become a graveyard of broken promises. The ride was long and bitterly cold. My coat wasn't enough for the drafty windows, and my fingers throbbed from gripping that letter like it might vanish if I blinked. I kept replaying his words in my mind: "Come to Baltimore. We'll talk." I didn't know what talk meant, but for the first time in weeks, I had a destination, and that was more than most women like me were given. After a man walked out, when the train finally pulled into Union Station, I stepped onto the platform in worn boots and windburned cheeks, clutching my satchel like it carried the crown jewels. Mason was waiting for me. He was taller than I remembered, though maybe it was the coat and his presence that made him seem like a monument. His silver hair was swept neatly back, and his eyes still sharp at 60. "Scanned the crowd until they found me. Sophia Lincon," he said, his voice deep and kind, with just a hint of mischief. "You look exactly like your mother." Same storm in the eyes. "I wish I had more of Papa's fire," I said. Mason smiled. "I think you've got both. That's a dangerous mix." He drove me to his townhouse near Mount Vernon Square, where a fire was already lit, and the smell of fresh bread floated through the hallways. It was elegant but warm, not like the cold grandeur of the Oak Ridge Bank building. Over dinner, I told him everything from Papa's passing to James leaving, and the loan rejection that sealed the fate of our farm. He listened quietly, nodding, pouring us both a glass of wine, never once interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Do you know what most people would have done, Sophia?" Cried. I said. He chuckled. "That and waited for someone else to solve it. But not you. You wrote to a man you hadn't seen in 7 years. That's bold." "I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. You just chose to fight." I stared into the fire. "I want to save the farm, Mason. But more than that, I want to take back my power. I want to own the place that told me I wasn't worth lending to." Mason didn't blink. "Then let's make that happen." And just like that, my second life began. The next morning, Mason took me to Everett and Roseman, a small but respected private finance firm tucked behind a row of ivy-covered buildings downtown. He introduced me as a future leader in community banking, and no one questioned it. I spent the following weeks shadowing him, reading everything I could get my hands on: lending policies, acquisition laws, loan structures, capital leverage. I studied late into the night, burning through candle after candle while Mason left handwritten notes on my work. "Smart angle. Watch this clause. You think like your father." I started to understand something important. Banks weren't just buildings. They were networks. They were chessboards with rules that could be learned and bent. One night, over a map of Vermont's local banking system, Mason pointed to Oak Ridge. "National. They've overextended themselves. Built 3 new branches in 2 years. You don't do that unless you're desperate for deposits." My eyes lit up. "You're saying they're vulnerable?" "I'm saying they're ripe for a storm. And you, Sophia, might just be the wind." We crafted a plan. Not just to buy a share of the bank, but to acquire enough to gain controlling interest. It wouldn't happen overnight. I needed capital, partners, a way in. That's when Mason introduced me to Elizabeth Hargrove, a widow in her 40s who had inherited her husband's lumber fortune but was tired of being dismissed in boardrooms. "I hear you're looking to make a few powerful men uncomfortable," she said, adjusting her pearl brooch. "I'd like to help." And just like that, I wasn't alone. Over the next month, we built what we called the Ashford Circle, a quiet coalition of women with money, land, and grudges against institutions like Oak Ridge. I returned to Vermont under the cover of night. On April 14th, wearing a tailored navy dress and heels that clicked like thunder on the bank's marble floors. I wasn't the girl James walked out on anymore. I was a woman with a plan, and I was coming for everything they thought I couldn't have. I stepped back into Ashford not as the abandoned girl they pitied, but as a storm no one saw coming. It was still cold for April. The sky hung heavy with slate-gray clouds, as if holding its breath for what was about to unfold. The town hadn't changed, but I had. My name, my voice, even the way I walked, every part of me had sharpened with purpose. The first thing I did was stop by the county clerk's office, where I requested every available public record on Oak Ridge National Bank, their board members, land holdings, expansion permits. I learned that the bank's president, Thomas Huxley, had personally signed my denial letter. I also learned he was facing pressure from a failed expansion in Rutland, a bad bet that had drained the bank's reserves and left them hungry for cash-rich investors. Perfect. By the following week, my business partner, Elizabeth Hargrove, had acquired a 9% silent stake in Oak Ridge under the name Hargrove Holdings LLC. We used her lumber wealth as the face while keeping me entirely invisible. Mason Everett, through Everett and Roseman, quietly purchased another 7% under a retirement fund trust. And me? I began collecting shares from old farmers and widows who held tiny pieces of Oak Ridge stock without knowing their value. It wasn't easy. I had to charm, negotiate, and sometimes beg without ever revealing my true intention. I told them the truth, mostly that I wanted to preserve the heart of Ashford from outside forces, that I cared about the people here, that I would make sure no family lost their home the way I nearly did. By May, I held enough shares to attend the upcoming shareholder meeting with legal right to speak, but I wasn't ready to show my face just yet. Instead, I planted seeds. The first was in the form of a quiet rumor that someone, a woman, no less, was looking to challenge Oak Ridge's leadership. I made sure it reached the ears of the board. The second seed was James. I hadn't seen him since Christmas Eve. But on May 10th, I walked into Wade's diner, in a fitted dress, ordered a cup of black coffee, and pretended not to notice him in the corner booth with 2 men from the bank. He saw me. His spoon stopped mid-air. "Sophia?" he said after a stunned pause, standing so fast his chair nearly fell. I sipped my coffee slowly. "James, You're back. Just passing through, I said. I've been in Baltimore, learning a few things. He sat, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. You look different. I am, I said flatly. You? He looked down. They offered me a junior partner title. I smiled. Congratulations. You always did like titles more than people. His expression faltered. You still at the farmhouse? He asked. No, you don't get to ask about my home, I said, standing. You left it, remember? The entire diner had gone quiet. He started, but I didn't wait for his excuse. I walked out, heels clicking on the tile like punctuation. For the first time, he was the one left behind. Later that week, I mailed my formal intent to attend the June 3rd shareholder meeting to the Oak Ridge board. It was signed with my full name, Sophia Lincon, primary shareholder. By then, I controlled just under 21% of the voting stock, enough to demand a hearing, propose new leadership, and rattle every man in that marble office. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window of Mason's guest room, staring out at the Baltimore skyline and gripping the angel ornament I'd brought from home. My mother's face drifted into my memory, then Papa's, then the weight of every woman who had ever been told no by a man in a polished suit. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every girl left behind on Christmas Eve. Every woman denied a seat at the table. Every voice silenced in a town like Ashford. At dawn, I dressed in a charcoal gray suit, tied my hair back in a sleek bun, and pinned the angel to my lapel. Then I caught the first train back to Vermont. When I arrived at Oak Ridge's headquarters, I didn't enter from the front door. I entered from the side, where the shareholders gathered. I walked past stunned faces and whispered questions. Past Thomas Huxley, whose face turned 3 shades paler when he saw me. Past James Whitmore, who looked like he'd seen a ghost. I took my seat near the front, unfolded my papers, and waited. When they called for new business, I stood. My name is Sophia Lincon, and I would like to introduce a motion for leadership review and restructuring of this institution's lending policies. Gasps. James rose halfway out of his seat. I looked straight at him. Consider this my formal return. You could have heard a pin drop in that boardroom when I said my name. Thomas Huxley, the president of Oak Ridge National Bank, blinked as if the air had gone dry. A low murmur rippled through the chairs behind me. Small shareholders, community members, old men in worn coats who had never seen a woman rise in this room with so much fire in her voice. But I didn't hesitate. I slid the stack of documents onto the table with steady hands. In accordance with Oak Ridge's charter, I am submitting a formal motion to review the current leadership of this institution and to recommend immediate revision of our rural and small property lending policies. Huxley cleared his throat. Miss Lincon, this is highly unorthodox. I'm sure it is, I said evenly. Just as it was unorthodox for your loan officer to deny a working woman the right to save her family's land while granting her fiancé an executive position. 3 towns away, all eyes turned toward James Whitmore, who looked as if the ground beneath him had shifted. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. I continued, raising my voice just enough. This bank was founded on the principle of community growth. Yet, in the last 5 years, we've seen declining loan approvals for family farms, for women-led businesses, and for any applicant who doesn't carry a familiar last name. Huxley leaned forward, voice tighter now. Miss Lincon, we can schedule a time for you to voice these concerns privately. No, I said, staring straight at him. You denied me privately. You shamed me privately. I'm speaking publicly. Gasps. Again, but this time, a few nods too. I pulled out the share register. I currently hold 21% of voting shares, either directly or through silent partnerships. According to your bylaws, I'm within my rights to propose an emergency vote. Huxley turned red. A small, weary man named Mr. Langley, who had sat on the board for over 20 years, squinted at me. You've been busy, Miss Lincon. I've been overlooked, I said. There's a difference. I glanced down the row. Elizabeth Hargrove was there, pearls gleaming, lips pursed into a proud smile. Mason Everett stood near the door, arms folded across his chest like a general surveying his troops. The board had no choice. Huxley called for a short recess. I stepped outside, the hallway cold against my skin but brimming with the heat of battle. James followed. Sophia, he started, breathless. I turned slowly. You should sit back down, James. This isn't your story anymore. He flinched. You're trying to destroy me. I tilted my head. I'm trying to rebuild what you and your bank tried to bury. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I never meant to hurt you. Things were complicated. No, I said, my voice colder now. You were a coward. You left me with debt and silence. And now you want what? Mercy, respect, a second chance? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I walked back into the room before he could say another word. When the board reconvened, I made one final statement. I'm not here to burn this bank down, I said. I'm here to remind it who it serves. I propose we open a dedicated rural lending division focused on supporting family-run farms, women-led businesses, and small property owners. I also propose that Mr. Huxley step down immediately. Murmurs again, some shocked, some thrilled, I added, and I will take his place as interim chair until the next formal election. The vote wasn't close, with Elizabeth's silent shares, Mason's trust, and the community investors who had quietly shifted their loyalties. I had the numbers. Thomas Huxley was removed. Effective immediately. James stood stiffly as I passed him. For once, he had nothing clever to say. By the end of that meeting, the girl who'd once begged for help had become Chairwoman Sophia Lincon of Oak Ridge National Bank. I didn't cry. Not yet. I walked outside into the cool breeze of early June, where the lilacs had just started to bloom along the sidewalk. Mason joined me, slipping a hand into his coat pocket and handing me a folded paper. What's this? I asked. A deed transfer, he said. The farm. You bought it back in full last night. Closed the deal at midnight. I opened the paper with shaking fingers. There it was, Lincoln Orchard, under my name once more. I don't even know what to say. He smiled. Say you're not done yet. I looked out across the street at the town that once looked down on me. No, I whispered. Not yet. The drive back to the orchard was slow, deliberate. I didn't take the highway. I took the long road through town, past the church, the diner, and the schoolhouse where Mama used to volunteer in winter. Ashford hadn't changed much. Same crooked fences, same clumps of lilacs along the yards. But everything looked different now, like the town had shrunk while I'd grown larger. When I pulled into the driveway of Lincoln Orchard, the wheels crackled over gravel I hadn't driven on in months. The farmhouse stood still, worn but proud. Its paint had chipped in places, the porch sagged a little more than I remembered, and the upstairs windows wept with dust, but it was mine. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the deed in my lap. This land was never just about apples or money. It was blood and memory. My father's sweat, my mother's prayers, my childhood. James might have abandoned it, but I was its daughter. I stepped out into the wind. The trees stretched before me, in patient rows, bare but full of promise. Spring had been slow this year, but the earth was ready. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. By the second day, I'd cleaned out the barn, patched up the back door, and called in help from Clara Finch, a widowed neighbor who once worked with my mother canning preserves. Together, we scrubbed, stirred, and rebuilt the orchard's small kitchen, where I planned to reopen our seasonal farm stand. What made you come back? Clara asked one afternoon, elbow deep in strawberry jam. I looked out the window toward the trees. The world tried to tell me this place didn't matter, that I didn't matter. So I came back to prove it does. And I do. Word traveled fast. By the following week, customers started returning, some out of loyalty, some out of curiosity. One by one, the townspeople who once pitied me came by with guarded smiles, as if testing whether the girl they ignored had really returned as the woman they heard about. And I let them come. I welcomed them, sold them preserves and cider, and handed out flyers that read, New loan office now open, Oak Ridge National. Lincoln Orchard Branch Chairwoman Sophia Lincon will be offering in-person consultation for small farm loans and property renewals. Yes, I had opened a branch right here on the very land the bank had once threatened to seize. The same land they told me I couldn't manage. Now it bore their name. Under mine. The irony was poetic. I restructured the lending process from the inside, streamlined approvals, required field assessments by local reps. No more denying loans just because a woman wasn't supported by a man. I made sure the names on those forms were seen: farmers, teachers, widows, daughters, people like me. But James, he didn't come, not until the end of June. I was kneeling in the soil by the front row of the orchard, planting new saplings in the exact row where Papa and I once worked side by side, when I heard a car roll up. I didn't turn around. I knew that engine. I knew that hesitation in the door. He approached slowly, like a man walking into a church he didn't belong in. Place looks good, James said. So do the lies you told, I replied, standing to wipe the dirt off my hands. He looked tired, not aged, but hollow, like something inside him had caved in. I didn't come to fight, he said. I came to say I was wrong. You left on Christmas Eve, James, I said, voice flat. That night still sits in this house like a ghost. I was scared, he said quietly. So was I, but I didn't run. He rubbed the back of his neck. You did all this on your own? No, I did it with the women this town pretended didn't matter. I did it with people you looked past. And I did it after the bank you worship tried to bury me. I never meant stop, I said, stepping closer. You didn't just leave me, James. You sided with the people who thought I was weak. You were wrong about them. And about me. He stared at the orchard. I think about you a lot. I tilted my head. That's not love. That's regret. Silence hung between us like a rope afraid to pull. You don't owe me anything, he said at last. But I had to see it for myself. What you built. I walked past him toward the house, then paused. You were right about one thing, though. He turned, brows raised. What's that? I am too much woman for you. And I shut the door. Inside, I stood at the kitchen window, watching him leave. I didn't cry. Not anymore. There were no tears left for men who leave when storms come. Now I was the storm. By early July, the orchard was thriving and so was the plan. The town of Ashford, once indifferent to my return, now relied on me. The Oak Ridge Orchard branch, though modest in space, was drawing in more clients than the main bank in town. Farmers from Eldon Creek, widows from Maple Junction, and small shopkeepers from as far as Carver Hollow were walking through my door for help. They didn't want marble floors and gold pens. They wanted someone who'd sit across from them and listen. I made it clear from day one no loan would be denied without a personal review. I read every file myself. I visited farms. I asked hard questions but gave honest answers. And when I approved a loan, I looked that person in the eye and said, you matter. No one had ever said that to me when I needed help. I wouldn't repeat that silence. Back in Baltimore, Mason Everett called weekly, asking for updates. We discussed growth, funding, and a longer-term vision. You've done it, Sophia, he said one evening. You've turned a betrayal into a movement. I'm just getting started, I replied, because something else had shifted since James visited the orchard. His apology hadn't been for me, it had been for his own guilt. But I saw it for what it was. Proof. Proof that even the powerful feel the sting when you rise without them. And I wasn't done rising. So I began phase 2. I reopened the files of every woman Oak Ridge Bank had denied in the last decade. There were hundreds. I mailed each of them a personal letter. My name is Sophia Lincon, and I am the chairwoman of Oak Ridge National Bank. I believe you deserved better. I want to make it right. Dozens wrote back. Some wept. Some offered support. Some sent records that proved discrimination, manipulation, and quiet cruelty, especially towards single women, women of color, and war widows. One letter stood out. It came from Annalise Carver, a 63-year-old seamstress from Bethel Ridge, who'd been denied a business loan 5 years earlier to expand her shop after her husband's death. The loan officer, James Whitmore, he'd written, insufficient income support and no male guarantor. Recommend denial. I stared at that phrase for a long time. No male guarantor. As if a woman couldn't stand on her own. That night, I sat in the orchard's office under a flickering oil lamp, staring at the photograph of my parents I kept on the desk. My mother had run this place when my father was injured during his final harvest season. No male guarantor, just grit. I whispered, they need to answer for this. The next morning, I filed a formal request to the Vermont State Banking Board for an internal audit of Oak Ridge's past lending practices, specifically targeting loans underwritten between 1917 and 1994. I submitted over 200 pages of documents, sworn statements, letters, rejections signed by the same few men, including James. The state responded swiftly. Within 2 weeks, an inquiry was launched. Subpoenas followed, and in mid-August, Thomas Huxley, who had stepped down but still lurked on the board, was called in for testimony. He tried to dismiss it as legacy paperwork, but numbers don't lie. And neither did the women. As the investigation gained steam, newspapers began to call. First the Ashford Gazette, then the Vermont Courier, then a bold piece in the Baltimore Register titled, "The Woman Who Turned a Broken Heart into a Banking Revolution." That title embarrassed me, but only for a moment, because I realized something. This was never just about revenge anymore. This was a reckoning. One afternoon, I received a telegram from Elizabeth Hargrove. Sophia, I've just been offered a seat on the Vermont Lending Commission. They want more women like you. Shall I accept? I smiled and sent my reply, yes. But tell them this time, more women like us. By late August, Oak Ridge National Bank had publicly apologized for its discriminatory lending history, but I didn't let them get away with a press release. I organized a gathering in the orchard. Over 200 women came. They stood between the trees in wide-brimmed hats, holding hands, reading aloud their rejection letters like sacred scrolls. And one by one, they burned them in a barrel lined with copper. It was no longer about one farm. It was about every woman who had been told she wasn't enough, and I knew in that moment James hadn't broken me. He'd awakened me. I looked at the barrel, flames licking the summer air, and thought, this is what real power feels like. Not fear, not revenge, justice. On the first morning of September, just as the orchard's apples began to blush with color, I received a formal letter sealed with the state crest of Vermont. I tore it open at the kitchen table, hands still dusty from the early harvest. The words inside made me pause. We are pleased to inform you, Miss Sophia Lincon, that you have been nominated for appointment to the Vermont State Banking Reform Council. Pending your approval, the governor's office would like to extend a seat to you effective October 1 Street. I stared at the paper for what felt like hours. Just 9 months ago, I had sat on these same floors in tears, clutching an eviction notice and a letter from the bank that called me not financially viable. Now I was being offered power over those very same institutions. Mason was the first I told. We met at the cafe in Burlington, tucked into a corner booth beneath low wooden beams and coffee-scented air. He read the letter, then chuckled low in his throat. I always said you'd change more than this orchard, he said. I didn't expect it to happen so soon, I replied, still stunned. He leaned forward. Don't mistake suddenness for unworthiness. You earned every inch of this path. I nodded, then hesitated. What if I'm not ready? You're ready, he said. You're the first person I've seen shake the foundation without ever raising your voice. As I rode the train back to Ashford that evening, the golden landscape rolled past like a dream. Cornfields swaying, the edges of the forest beginning to turn orange and red. Autumn was on its way and so was change, but not everyone was celebrating. When I arrived back at the orchard, Clara was waiting on the porch, apron still dusted in flour. She held a newspaper, her eyes wide with tension. You should read this, she said quietly. It was the Ashford Gazette front page. James Whitmore resigns from Oak Ridge Bank following investigation. Findings me heart clenched. I sat down on the steps and read every line. The state board had concluded that several loan officers, including James, had demonstrated a consistent pattern of gender-based bias in loan denials. While criminal charges were not filed, the reputational blow was severe. James had been pressured to resign. I folded the paper slowly. He'd lost everything he'd sacrificed me to gain. That evening, I saw him again. He stood just beyond the orchard's fence line, hands in his pockets, as if unsure whether he had the right to walk onto my land. I didn't go to him. I kept tending the trees, clipping the lower branches, my back turned. But he didn't leave. After several minutes, I finally straightened and met his gaze. He stepped forward a few paces. They forced me out, he said. I know, I replied, brushing dirt from my gloves. I guess I deserve it, he said, eyes low. I said nothing. I didn't come to beg, Sophia. I just wanted to say, I see it now. What you did, what you are. I leaned against the tree trunk. You never saw me before, James. You saw what I could give you. A name, a home, a way out. He nodded, shame thick in his posture. I didn't believe a woman could hold all this power, and I hated that I was wrong. There it was, the truth. He hadn't just left out of fear. He'd left because my strength scared him. Well, I said, you were wrong. But you weren't the only one. They all were. He took a step back, hands trembling slightly. I'm leaving Ashford. I didn't flinch. Then I hope the road is long enough for reflection. His eyes glistened, but I didn't soften. Not anymore. I did love you, he said finally. Maybe, I replied, but not in the way I needed to be loved. He turned and walked away slowly, fading into the road that had once brought him home and would never again. Later that night, I sat on the porch beneath a sky splashed with stars, the cool wind wrapping around my shoulders. I opened my journal, Papa's old one, the leather cracked and soft, and wrote, "Today, the past finally stopped chasing me. Today, I stopped being someone who survived and became someone who leads." The next morning, I accepted the governor's offer. I would take my seat on the State Banking Reform Council, not for power, not even for revenge anymore, but for every woman who still walked into banks with trembling hands and walked out with closed doors. Ashford had given me pain, but it also gave me purpose, and I wasn't done yet. By the first frost of October, I took my oath at the Vermont State House. Under vaulted ceilings and solemn marble eyes that had watched men rise for centuries, I stood in a navy dress, my mother's pin tucked beneath the collar, and raised my hand as the room went still. "I, Sophia Lincon, do solemnly swear to uphold the interests of the people." The words felt heavier than any vow I'd spoken before, because this wasn't just a title, it was a reckoning. When I walked out of that chamber, snowflakes began to drift down over Montpelier, soft and slow, as if even the sky had paused to witness what had just happened. A woman from Ashford, once told she wasn't viable, now held the power to change the very system that tried to break her. I wasn't the only one watching either. That same day, a little girl named Rosie McCallum, the daughter of a seamstress I'd helped in June, ran up to me outside the courthouse. She couldn't have been more than 9, with freckles across her cheeks and wide brown eyes. "Miss Lincon," she said, out of breath, "Mama said to tell you thank you. Because now she has her own shop." I knelt, snow gathering in my hair, and smiled. "Tell your mama I didn't give her that shop, she already had it in her heart. I just helped unlock the door." Rosie reached into her coat and handed me a tiny red apple, carved from wood. "We made it for you." I held it in my palm, the smallest and most perfect gift I'd ever received. That night, I returned to the orchard and placed it on my desk beside the old brass bank seal, the one I'd demanded they give me when I became chair. One was power, the other purpose. I would never forget which mattered more. The next few weeks were a blur of motions, reforms, and policies. I worked with rural banks across Vermont to revise approval processes, enforce bias training, and launch funding pools for women-owned farms and businesses. But there was still one final act I hadn't completed. I wanted to make Lincoln Orchard more than a memory. I wanted to make it eternal. So I drew up the charter myself. On the morning of November 15th, standing beneath a pale blue sky, I signed the final document. The Lincoln Center for Rural Women and Entrepreneurship Orchard would no longer just be a place of harvest. It would become a school, a sanctuary, and a launch pad for women who dreamed beyond their fences. We would teach farming, bookkeeping, loan literacy, and land ownership. We would give them what I never had, a path paved with knowledge. The ribbon cutting, Clara gave the opening prayer. Mason held the scissors. Elizabeth Hargrove arrived, in a fine gray coat and rosy freckles, and all cut the ribbon beside me. People came from all over the state to see it. Some cheered, some cried. Even a few old bankers stood in the crowd, humbled. But not James. I never saw him again after that last conversation. And I didn't need to. He had become a page in my story, not the ending, not even the midpoint. Just a bitter line in the first chapter of the book I was writing every day. One night, just before Thanksgiving, I walked through the orchard alone. The trees stood bare, the moon hung low, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and frost. I paused at the edge of the rows and looked out over the land that nearly slipped through my fingers, and I whispered, "You didn't win." I did. Not to James, not to the bank, but to the doubt that once lived inside me, because the truth was, they hadn't just tried to take my home, they tried to take me, and I had taken everything back. The orchard was no longer a place of heartbreak, it was a symbol. And I was no longer just Sophia Lincon, the girl who was left on Christmas Eve. I was Sophia Lincon, chairwoman, reformer, founder. And this was only the beginning. It was Christmas Eve again, exactly 1 year to the day since James walked out of my life and left behind nothing but silence and unpaid bills. 1 year since the letter from the bank told me my family's land would be taken. 1 year since I sat on the cold kitchen floor, wondering how I had been discarded so easily. But this year, I was standing tall in the parlor of Lincoln Orchard, firelight glowing on the walls, music playing softly on the gramophone, and laughter echoing from the kitchen where Clara and the other women were preparing cider and spice cakes. The Lincoln Center was closed for the holiday, but the orchard never really slept. Outside, the snow fell quietly over the rows of trees, blanketing them like pages waiting to be written on. I walked to the old desk by the front window and opened Papa's journal, now nearly full. The first entry was mine, written the night I bought the bank. Tonight would be the last. December 24, 1925. A year ago, I was a woman left behind. Tonight, I am a woman who owns her past, her land, and her name. This year, I didn't just survive, I changed the story for every woman who comes after me. I closed the journal gently, fingers lingering on the leather. Then I stood, wrapped a wool shawl around my shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. The orchard was quiet beneath the snow. A young woman from Millridge, a student at the center, stepped out beside me. Her name was Josephine Ray, and she reminded me of myself, sharp, stubborn, and full of ideas no one had yet bothered to listen to. She stared out into the snow and asked softly, "Miss Lincoln, do you think it's really possible that someone like me could own land one day?" I looked at her. She was barely 20, her boots too thin for the snow, a notebook tucked beneath her arm full of sketches for a berry farm she dreamed of opening one day. I smiled. "Josephine, they'll tell you you need a man's name, or a co-signer, or a bigger dowry. But let me tell you something very clearly." She leaned in. "You don't need permission to belong on your own land. You just need courage and one person who believes you can." She swallowed hard. "What if I'm scared?" I took her hand. "Then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Change always starts with someone who's scared and stands up anyway." We stood there for a long time, watching the orchard disappear under the snow. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill the same way Mama used to do every Christmas Eve, saying it would help lost souls find their way home. But this year, I wasn't lighting it for someone else. I was lighting it for the woman I used to be, the one who sat in the dark, crying quietly, thinking she'd lost everything. The one who thought love was supposed to save her. The one who thought being left meant being unworthy. That woman had been strong, too, she just didn't know it yet. I watched the candle flicker and thought, if he could see me now, what would he say? Maybe nothing. Maybe he wouldn't dare speak, because he hadn't just left me. He left the fire that forged me, and now that fire lit up this home, this land, and every life it touched. As the clock struck midnight, I whispered into the silence, "Merry Christmas, Sophia." And this time, I meant it, because I didn't need anyone to give me a future. I'd already bought it. Reflection questions: do you think James truly loved Sophia, or only the idea of what she could offer? Was Sophia's revenge more about justice or about proving something to herself? What moment in the story felt like her true turning point? Could you forgive someone who abandoned you in your worst moment? Subscribe to more revenge stories. Share, like, comment.